critics. This morning, I'm going to mention the ones who I'm seeing in the room. Everybody's names are in the chat and on the poster. So if I overlook anybody, please forgive me. This morning, we have with us Leighton Reed, a professor from University of West London. We have obviously Neil Denari, the critic at large for his last event, who's joining us from Los Angeles and UCLA. We have Patrick Gustafson, economist, theorist, who has been joining us throughout the year for these events, who's based in Denmark. Stephen Slaughter, I'm just going around the room based on who I see here, so there's no particular order. Stephen Slaughter, who's teaching with us this semester in a visiting capacity and joining us from Cincinnati. Next, we have Kabaj Karanja, who's joining us from Kenya, principal of Cave Bureau, and one of our visiting and distinguished fellows this year. And who else is in the room? We also are joined by professors who are teaching with us and who visited with us in the past. I see Joe McDonald here. I see Ariane Harrison, who's the MS coordinator. And of course, we are anchored this morning by the students and the faculty. The professors for this first session are Theo David, Jim Garrison, Maria Sierra, Bill McDonald, Eric Schonenberger, and did I miss anybody?
Nope.
Okay, got everyone. Welcome to the critics and welcome to the students. We spoke a little bit in the green room, if you will, the breakout room before this about the problem with the critics. Neil and I have looked at this extensively in advance of this session, so he's familiar with it. The students will kick off this morning with about 25 minutes of back-to-back pre-recorded presentations, 5 minutes per section, typically one student per section, though that may deviate. Epilogues is supposed to be the students' cold read, we call it a cold read, of what they have today and what that might have been if it were to be realized, and some of the machinations, social politics, and financial aspects of what would have been required to realize it. We're hoping the students engage this. Some may deviate from it, but that's what Neil and I have tried to lay out, and this is the second version of this, so we're excited to see it today. There's about an hour to an hour and a half discussion after the student presentations. On the Miro board, which we'll put in the chat in a minute, you can see all the students' work from all the sections. Discussion is not limited only to the presentees. And the first half hour or so of discussion will be student-led. Students have been asked to come with questions. However, if they're not leading the discussion, critics have the floor. The second half of the discussion, again, about a half hour or so, is critic-led. We will be taking an hour break after the first session. Between that and the second section, the afternoon will be followed by two nearly back-to-back sessions with a half-hour break in between, ending comments, and a reception on spatial chat that we hope all of the students and faculty and visiting critics will come join us for a toast and a drink in. For those of you that don't know spatial chat, it's not Zoom. I think that's the main thing that you want to know. So all of us are zoomed out, zoned out. This is a room that we can actually kind of gather in. It's good for big gatherings. It's still mediated, so it's not in person, but come have a drink, a celebratory drink with us, whether it's midnight or 6 p.m. If you're game, we'd love to see you there. The full schedule's just been posted. And with that, I think I'm gonna hand it over to the critics and the students of the first year Master of Architecture program. The floor is yours. Thank you again for putting all of this together today, Jeff Olson, and students and faculty. Who's going first? Do we know? Are we going left to right on the Miro board?
Let's go left to right. So that means Bill McDonald's studio will be first if they're ready.
Perfect.
Hi everyone, my name is Venice and I'm co-presenting with Christy Martinez for Bill McDonald Studio. So we prepared a quick video for you guys to understand our project. Is it possible if I can share screen here?
Yeah, Jeff may not have enabled it. There you go.
To me, school is a place where you could learn education, where you could connect with your students and classmates, and where you could express your learning and creativity.
Located on the corner of 43rd Street and 4th Avenue is a public school proposal which deals with the emerging social and educational needs of students. Our studio's aim was to look at and challenge traditional views of a classroom. We looked at the advancements in terms of education and pedagogy in middle school as a whole progressive series. By researching new methods of education, such as flipped classrooms, online video preparations, and more, we identified our projects as an infrastructure for the exploration and application of a project-based education. Through our constant exploration and reinterpretation of different sports, our studio created forms which reflected back to the idea of redefining school. These new discoveries led to the creation of variegated spaces in order for learning to occur while maintaining some traditional aspects. In this first project, Chrissy started off with the tennis intensity map and generated a sequence of instances in time. These patterns constantly shifted depending on the player's movement and strategy, so the analysis simultaneously developed a spatial condition that addresses ideonomies such as counterbalance, cooperation, focus, and dramatic behaviors. By identifying counterbalance movement in her intensity map analysis, a push and pull action allowed her to understand how form would correspond to movement. The results of this analysis were deployed onto the site to learn the relations between model, site, and context, while also understanding interstitial movements that started to alter the site. By allowing the site to manipulate the deployment and set relationships, Christie identified movements that performed the push in and pull out of the public realm to interplay with masses, which generated interior and exterior spaces. The counterbalance behavior also continuously negotiated with the center mass and generated spaces that leaped into each other, connecting and disconnecting parts of the direct context in order to achieve a continual fluctuation between public realm and interiority. The identification of these contrasting moments organized program in both collaborative and individual learning spaces. As far as the learning environment goes, this proposal intends to generate a balance between the classic enclosed learning environment that has long been seen as the effective learning environment, since it could be less distracting while innovating outdoor learning spaces. Furthermore, the project takes form into context by generating spaces which allow the urban landscape to interact with the formal design of the school building. The design stretches inward and outward, generating deep curvilinear spaces that are unconventional and perform as intricate learning spaces. On its interior, Christie developed a programmatic idea that is integrated into the form development of the initial process, taking into consideration the guidelines and programs for the middle school itinerary. The plan still behaved with the residue of the initial generative process, incorporating the vision of the conceptual ideas and the spatial sequence. The main opportunity is to break loose of the conventional idea of a school design and integrate a process of behavior and movement that are captured by ideonomies and then put forward into a three-dimensional state. In the next snippet, we'll be addressing Venice's process and project realization.
Welcome to FLIP, short for Facilitated Learning Interactive Program. With today's generation heavily reliant on the internet, students can learn from multiple platforms, expanding their ideas, gaining new interests, and increasing understanding of educational topics outside of school, which have effectively increased engagement in classrooms. FLIP challenges the idea of a conventional classroom by expanding and integrating the FLIP classroom method into its curriculum. The school encourages at-home learning, allowing students to come to school with increased interest in various disciplines. This helps teachers foster their education best fit for them. FLIP, originally inspired by intensity maps, tracking an athlete's activity during a game, is structured around the idea of guided decentralization, where certain programs are organized based on the paralleling aspects of subjects, coach forms of learning, and/or group sizes, doubling a space's purpose. Nestled in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, Flip welcomes students through its interior courtyard with its first floor serving as a cafeteria. Two elevators can be used to gain access to the school's upper floors. The second floor showcases a seating area made for group discussions. The third encourages the use of technology, presenting a screening room and nooks for computer use. Going up to the fourth floor, physical activity is encouraged through the school's hills and open plan layouts, which is mirrored on the sixth floor. Much like the fifth floor, the seventh floor introduces open classrooms, with others being closed for classes which opt for private discussions. Overall, Flip encourages and fosters students' interests and curiosities, allowing and unleashing true character potential.
When considering code for Venice's project, one obvious feature of the Flip Learning School is its height relative to the surrounding buildings. Standing at 90 feet, it exceeds the maximum height for its residential district. Due to the school's profound potential impact on the community, the district was redefined as an LH3 district, so the building's height became allowable. Its sheer amount of space open to the exterior relieves it of any sun exposure plane restrictions. Some of these spaces were classified as pocket parks in addition to its first floor open area, so the only spaces subject to temperature control and conditioning were those to be fully enclosed. On the other hand, Christie's site needs to be de-landmarked so that any modification of its existing facades can be proceeded without going through the tedious process of community boards and LPC or Landmark Preservation Commission approvals. The site also needs to be rezoned so that the collaborative and trusting spaces can be made without building code restrictions like required dimensions and natural light requirement for habitable space. The main reason why it would make sense to build a school on that lot would be that preserving existing walls of the old police building brings no value or function to that neighborhood, and it would make sense to build something for the community there instead. The old walls were built to suggest control over the community that the police station once had. And so it would be more beneficial to build a school which would extend its boundaries to the entire community. Some possible sources of funding would be the city school board and donors from the community who might be interested. The community would benefit from funding the school, as these buildings will be more than just a school, but a place for the local community to use it in off-peak hours. Aside from funding the school via the city and state, another route would be to seek help from foundations who specialize in the flipped learning method. While the concept of the flipped learning classroom is still relatively new, there are multiple educational foundations that offer to aid schools who are willing to make the switch from traditional learning to flipped learning. Organizations like the Future of School Foundation and the Flipped Learning Global Initiative offer finance and technological aid to teachers and school districts looking to switch to flipped learning. Foundations such as these would most likely be interested in sponsoring the construction of an entire school where both the architecture and program are geared toward flipped learning. By prioritizing innovative and empirically successful learning environments and methods such as the flipped classroom and the integration of indoor-outdoor interchange, these designs more closely align with the development of today's students and faculty. As a needed reevaluation of the site, both in terms of its historical implications and architectural derivation of space, both of these concepts would address conditions of the funding sources we mentioned while also providing an opportunity for this unique architectural exploration of spatial programming that justifies exceptions to typical codified restrictions. As our understanding of social and physical landscapes evolve, so too must that of our educational landscapes. And within these two projects, we begin to expand upon our understanding of what schools and their spaces are for.
Great. Thank you, students. And
Thank you, guys. So we go
we
to
are
my
we're moving
studio.
on to yours. Yes, right. Great. Thank you, Eric.
Oh, it's not sharing. Oh, no, it is. Oh,
There's no sound on
wait,
here. Right
I
now.
think, yes, I think that's my mistake. Sorry.
Yeah, sound now.
Everybody learns differently, and everyone needs variation as an essential part of learning and growth. Looking at binary oppositions of solitude and community through the lens of indoctrination in education guided me to further elaborate these oppositions into the spaces and, instead of contrasting them, connect. Connecting spaces between the striations create cell-like structures, whereas they establish separate but interconnected spaces. This becomes reminiscent to some natural elements, micro or macro, like termite mounds or canyons. Reversing the spaces surrounding the striations create an experience as if you were walking in between the mountains. This sort of an indirect connection to nature has an intent to bring that feeling of aliveness to activate learners' minds and senses. Vibrant colors, strategic light, and materials direct attention, while the vast and flexible spaces create dynamic learning processes. Located on the corner of 43rd Street and 4th Avenue in Sunset Park, Brooklyn, New York, is a middle school that plans to offer a positive impact, both on the surrounding neighborhood and the students that use it. Analyzing primitive plans and sections was the genesis of this project. Mud huts and castle floor plans were reconfigured and disintegrated to create a collage that focused on circularity and organic sensibilities. The final geometry elicits an interstellar form which complements the concept of eclipse. An eclipse is an obstruction of light from one celestial body by the passage of another between it, the observer, and its source of illumination. The intention of this design exploration are to study and analyze the passage of light through the different arrangements of obstruction of form. In my physical exploration, I wanted to explore material that evoked a direct, elemental, and timeless dialogue. This physical exploration allowed me to study how light casted and bounced off the undulating walls of my forms. In response to privacy, I focused on perforated and semi-opaque materiality that both allowed light into the space and seclusion to the children and faculty that occupy it. The middle school is organized as a ring of classes and rooms. Rooms vary in sizes, configuration, and light conditions. This versatile space encourages social interaction. Below ground, we'll have the auditorium and storage, spaces that don't need much light. The gym will be located on the first floor, extending physical activities conveniently to the surrounding neighborhood. The cafe will also occupy the first floor, sitting right next to the other restaurants aligned on the street. The library, science, and art rooms will be located above the first floor, so as to have the most light. Historically, eclipses have acted as a symbolic portal for exponential growth, a time of rapid change, both internally and externally. These characteristics will continue to drive my design decisions for the school.
That was Priscilla and Diana.
I love the changing moods of the videos. Goes well with a morning coffee. I don't know how it
Right.
goes with an afternoon coffee in London and Denmark, but and Kenya.
So now it would be oops, I just did something here.
Maria's student.
Yes.
Right?
Mhm.
Or son Nicholas.
Hello everyone, I'm Ersan İktan and I'm presenting with Nicholas Shamra.
New York City has been able to accommodate population growth while still maintaining its system of waterfront parks, and conversely, gardens have expanded to cover public school roofs. The building of rooftop greenhouses on schools that started in early 21st century and founded in the combination of public funds and specific fundraising efforts later developed into a coordinated program of education, environmental justice, and food justice. The pollinating bee, vital for the preservation of ecological balance and biodiversity in nature, is representative of the school as social nexus idea, the exchange of ideas in a school community, now expanded to include not just the school children, their educators, and their families, but also those living in the neighborhood of school.
As a studio, we investigated how typical aspects of a middle school program, such as health, performance, and education, could expand its impact beyond the school and into the surrounding community. Rather than incorporating an aspect of community at the end of the design process, we started designing a school, the social nexus from the start. Two projects from the studio look more closely at how school and social nexus can interrelate. In the years 2020 and 2021, an emphasis was placed on the important need for all schools to have a space where classes can be held outdoors. This project took the lessons learned from the COVID-19 pandemic into consideration when devoting a large portion of the site's footprint to the design of an outdoor plaza. During the day, the outdoor plaza is gated and can be utilized as spaces for classes to be held or a place where field trips can be organized and such. Plaza can be used as a form of community outreach as well. In the evening, the gates are lowered to allow for public access as the space becomes an outdoor community plaza. Local events can take place, such as performances and large gatherings. In addition to the design of the plaza and school as a social nexus, the envelope and plaza pattern are in a mosaic. The mosaic is derived from the local context of the storefront logos along Fifth Avenue, where a concentration of Latino businesses and families are located. Plaza and sidewalk pattern consists of permeable pavers for their sustainable benefits concerning stormwater drainage. The laying of this mosaic pattern during construction featured teachers and faculty of the school, as well as other members of the community, were invited to help lay the permeable tiles of which the mosaic consisted of. It was a huge success, as the local community felt as though they had a hand in building this new school in their neighborhood.
My own middle school experience inspired me to make this collage, where our school had an indoor street that connected multiple floors vertically. Social nexus as an interior condition emerged. By starting with these line work drawings to merge individual fragmented experiences of students onto a 2D-dimensional relationship, I produced these spatial slit walls that activate rich spatial relationships where nooks and threshold conditions are being generated. This spatial tool is used for generating interior public space. We're now using lunchtime as a hybrid between performance and campus. The school is being supported by the performances that are happening during the evening hours. Physical models of the space to speculate on the integrated relationship of spaces. The physical, intimate level and smaller scale interactions between the students and the school is happening in the core of the building, which is the lobby space. My project, the lobby space, is an example of the larger scalar decisions. The inside of this chunk is a learning space that is determined by the instructors themselves, Our site with the definition of that block condition, which is typical for Brooklyn, is related with revealing and concealing. Facade introduces a new kind of creativity that allows students to project their own ideas onto the school. Mass customization of the panels offers the off-site efficient production of the materials.
Great, thank you. Looks like we're going to Theo's section next.
I'm Ryan from DD Studio.
There's no sound on this right now, guys.
Sorry.
The site is located on the corner of 4th Ave and 43rd Street. On the left is towards New York and New Jersey, and on the right is more into Brooklyn. This is of the precedent studies we did, looking for non-typical classrooms of each learning space. This is an abstract sketch from Theo David of our buildings. The community would like for the existing facade to be kept, but it prevented some schemes to be realized. These iconic images were selected by each student, showing the diversity of our approaches and how our schemes developed from a learning space to the school. These are the learning spaces from scale, outdoors, experience physically and psychologically, and from adjacent buildings, highway, subway, sound, murals, material, climate, and floods. The focus was centered around the students since they are the main users. These middle schoolers are grades from 6 through 8, approximately 11 to 14 years of age. Back to the studio's syllabus, I quote, "Middle schoolers need to play. Physical fitness at this age is as important as ever." These students would have to spend their days every day in one building, almost spending more time at school than home, not including sleep hours. Like in my scheme, offers many spaces for students to occupy. My scheme consists of different levels from one space to another, and within one space by a connected circulation. According to users and programs, from ground level to the highest level is the shared spaces to learning spaces, more active and loud to private and quiet. The stairs and ramps and elevators allow different modes of access and accessibility. As the main losers and being teenagers, they get to have a school that's fun to be in, they get more outdoor areas than the closest playgrounds, and they get to have views to the water, the skyscrapers, and above the buildings. And even within the classroom, they can move around, not have assigned seats, and change their location.
North of Sunset Park District is an industrial area. As the previous image shows, the area is not just a working environment, but also a space that people can have outdoor exercise activity, which is able to reach the place in many aspects and increase the opportunity of interacting with people. Also, steel is an important material that promotes the industry revolution. Therefore, in my project, I use a concrete as the building core and the steel structure as a facade. Also, there is a sky bridge that help connect to the existing Catholic school. SCV represents school members, community, and even visitor. Those of them allow use this space. Well, circulation is one of the main concepts within my project. There are several entries to access the school. The green arrow is the main entries, and the red is a lateral entry. And the light blue is the exterior stair, which allows the users going up to the top floor, which is a public space. Also, they can go into the building from the third floor. Basement level and the fifth levels are public space. People can down to the basement from sidewalk directly to use the library and the cafeteria. Through the exterior stair, they arrive at the top of the Catholic school and use another bridge back to the fifth floor of the project. There is a sports area and the outdoor theater on the fifth floor. Circulation should be considered not only for human use but also for air and light. The section shows that there are huge open roofs that allow sunlight to come into the school. Also, the floor has glass panels. The light can penetrate into whole building through the middle part of building. And the left bottom image is a typical learning environment. As we can see, the facade triangular panels can be opened partially like a window, so that open space improve the air quality in classes. Thank you for listening.
Great, and we will end with Jim's Garrison section.
Hey everybody, I'll be presenting for Jim's studio. And this is my name is Matt Mendocino, and this is my project, Supportive Spaces. The middle school located on the corner of 4th Avenue and 43rd Street in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. Our studio began by researching various precedent studies that explore designing schools with many different spatial objectives. A few of the precedents we studied were Forest Gate Community School by Cahoon and Miller, Open Air School by Jan Dijker, and the Hunstanton School by Allison and Peter Smithson. Each of these precedents is different in its own right, but share instances where congregation throughout the day is enforced and encouraged. From the initial project prompt, my objective in designing a middle school was to create a space in which students and other stakeholders in the schooling community felt compelled to interact and socialize. The project, in which I have titled Supportive Spaces, was an exploration in developing a programmatic massing strategy that could provide an environment for educational and social growth. From my time in a public middle school system, I always gravitated towards the more open or community spaces in the school. These spaces became a very important part of my own and other students' experience throughout the day. They became areas within the school where students had a sense of ownership, a space where we felt comfortable to be ourselves. The chief objective of my massing strategy was to create a spatial quality within the school that would single out this sort of social experience and allow students to meet, learn, and grow in school, but not in the traditional classroom setting. A second design motivator with different implications became involved when I decided to keep a portion of the existing facade. The decision resulted in the creation of a structural steel insert that could support the masonry and create a new spatial and material relationship with the concrete massing. A system of supported bridges and a suspended terrace allows students to occupy areas between and within both the old facade and the new structure. Students can eat lunch inside of the tower of the old police station or travel to the 4th floor suspended atrium and enjoy views of Sunset Park and Lower Manhattan while they learn and socialize. This structure provides wonderful spatial opportunity, but for it to be realized, a heavy-duty support system would need to be properly engineered. Currently, the masonry is in a severe state of disrepair. It is likely that the interior-facing side of the brick would need to be reconstructed or plated with a supportive layer of steel, so a system of struts could properly connect and secured in place. As the steel supports rise up from the ground, they host two bridges, both of which span the entire 43rd Street section. One bridge extends the footprint of the cafeteria outward toward the corner tower and allows students to enjoy meals with a view of the entire school or enter the tower itself to hang out. On the third floor, another bridge connects the ends of the concrete massing, creating a donut-like plan that houses student lounge space and various seating areas that can host after-school activities or other gatherings. For further realization of this project, certain exceptions must be made by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. Although not much is left of the previous 68th Police Precinct, my design does not keep all that is there. Lots of the ornamentation and the previous main entry have been removed, and code and regulation for preservation efforts must be amended to accommodate construction. A city school deserves to play an important role in the lives of each community member, but most importantly in the lives of its students. This project aims to enforce a socially inclusive environment between the school, its inhabitants, and the surrounding community. The following are images of projects from our studio which explore a number of spatial, material, and organizational ideas applied to a middle school environment. Audrey Tuck, Michael Pitozzi, Shifting Context, Andrew Mickelson, Oracle, The School in the Sky, Mel Chua, Emily Gibson, Circulation Parallax, Sokena Asar, Responsive Spaces, Honor Weatherall, Basket Weave, Robin Piat Stegman, Reeves Connolly. Thank you everybody for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you to the students and the faculty for putting together these presentations. So we will kick this off with student-led discussion. If any students have questions or would like to jump in, we'd love to hear from a student first. Otherwise, we will pause periodically to prod you into engaging us in discussion. Okay, as is the case in the past. So let me welcome our critics, and Neil, if you have any initial observations, and faculty, the floor is open.
I think it's a great problem for project for first year. Infill urbanism, the tension that a school program has embedded within it, which is especially today, and having had some experience with this, humility and iconicity somehow coming together, the nature of the monument within a program that's also infrastructural in many ways, think of fire stations and so forth. Marking the urban system vis-a-vis a grid, which is more prominent in Jim's studio. Other studios identifying sectional vitality as an extrapolation of the city from the ground plane. Downtown athletic club as a driver for both connective and kind of non sequitur programs, shears and shocks. I think the nature of form language, associating vitality in a school and interconnectivity with a mirroring of a form language, fluidity, for instance. In some cases, students using things like metaphors and landscapes and mountain ranges. I think there's a lot of tangents here to obviously investigate and kind of talk about, and I'm sure that was the case in the studio. So those are my initial sets of things that we could delve into.
I've asked Eric Schonenberger, the coordinator for the core studios and one of the professors in this particular studio, to kind of fly around the Miro board in the background while we're talking. Other professors, critics, students?
Hey, can I just make a quick question?
Please.
The videos were great to kind of understand individual student projects, but I'm wondering if like a student representative from each of the studios can maybe give like a 20 or 30-second pitch in terms of how their studios, what their conceptual processes were to arrive at their final forms. Like I know, for example, the first studio, I think it was what was it, Bill's studio, that was really into categorizing and documenting movements and turning that into a form. I'm just curious to see what each studio's concept was and their directive.
Any student takers on that? I'm sure there will be opportunities for that to come up in the next hour, but I think that should be student led. If anybody from Bill's section or other sections would like to take a half a minute or so to talk about methodology, that would be welcome. We did talk about it a bit in the pre-session with the critics, but for the audience, it could be helpful. Melissa, would you like to, oh, sorry, go ahead. Priscilla, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I could speak for our studio and our process.
Yeah, please.
So at the beginning of the semester, Eric introduced us to like floor plans and had us kind of research different floor plans and create collages out of them. And as I said in my video, that those were like the genesis of our concepts. So creating collages through other floor plans we found online. And then it just went from there.
Thank you, Priscilla, for being the guinea pig. Melissa, did you want to say a few words?
Sure. And other people from my studio can jump in if I am inaccurate in this, but our studio took a very interesting approach to coming to where we are. It is very grid-based, but we went through a series of exercises in the beginning of our studio, like how to create a horizontal sequence, how to create vertical sequences, really setting precedents from each different type of process in order to understand. And a lot of us, I think, in our studio came from non-architectural backgrounds, so it really helped us understand sequences of space and how to string them together in a logical, cohesive way. And that is really kind of what drove our precedents for our resulting schools. But I do want to defer to my studio mates in case I represented it in a different way.
So Marissa, I forgot which studio you were in.
Oh, I'm in a Studio Garrison.
Oh, right. I thought, but I wasn't sure.
Any other students want to add a little bit to context before we open it back up again for discussion?
If I can jump in for Bill's studio.
Yeah, sure, Q, please.
In our studio, we started by taking 30-second snippets of sports. So there were things like soccer, tennis, table tennis, and others, which we extracted the essential forms of the players and cataloged their movement, as well as off-ball movement, or on-ball and off-ball movement. So taking these into account, we started to create masses that, I guess, were cut with the direction and speed in mind. So in that, we use the Gordon-Meta-Clark method and sort of intentionally made these masses into voids in time. I think the part that interested me the most were the ways that we carried out the intensity mappings. So instead of just looking at the masses cut, we also started to think of the ways that we can categorize the way that people play the game, the way that they move, and how their speed affects the overall composition.
Can I call on one of my students?
Sure, Theo, please.
Amy, can you explain the thinking behind your scheme, please?
Sure.
And maybe refer to others also, if you wish.
Yeah, I could speak to for our entire studio. The way that we approached it was that Theo had us start by exploring a single classroom module or two classroom modules. And then from there, that was supposed to be like a mini version of our entire learning environment. And that was kind of our process. Did you want me to speak about mine specifically, or?
Sure, as a way of explaining the methodology of the class.
Yeah, so mine kind of progressed from like the, how do I say it? Well, it kind of started with like sound as like the inspiration. And so module, my single learning module, I was exploring how, what sort of form would work for like a classroom that wouldn't have too much noise distraction so that the students could focus. And then I sort of used that basis of like sound and noise for the programming of my entire school learning environment. So I placed like learning modules towards the upper floors and like the more noisier community spaces like the gymnasium or auditorium near the lower floors. And that's kind of like my progression specifically. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Critics or students, any observations or thoughts, comments?
So I put this in the chat, but maybe someone can lock the mural board.
I saw that. Yeah, it's a chronic problem, Maria. And
I've done it, by the way, Patrick.
As much as you. Yeah, thank you.
By the way, Patrick, I've done it. I've like moved sections like completely out of range. So I'm the first person that's guilty about this. And then I also want to call on Nicholas and Ursan to say how we began.
Thank you. Yep.
In our section, we actually focused on the barn stair as a starting point and how the landings really changed the experience of the users. And in terms of the school design, we understood that the vertical circulation is a really important aspect of the project. And therefore, activating the landings is very important. So we all started with a stair design at first, with barn stairs. And also we added social elements of like a program, for example, performance areas or library areas as a starting point.
And just from the perspective of the professor, what I thought was that by starting with the stair, we also had a lot of people in our section that had no architectural background. So by starting with the stair, we were able to address issues of plan and section right away, and also issues of interiority.
Great, thank you. Anybody want to jump in?
Robin, can I ask you to talk briefly about the idea behind yours?
Yeah, sure. Eric, it's the upper right.
Yeah, I know which one. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so I began with a precedent study of the open air learning movement, which influenced my individual learning environment. And then taking that idea, I moved into the whole 100 by 150 foot site, and wanted to create a kind of a school with a permeable barrier between the interior and exterior spaces, which also included a public park in the back section of the plan. So I looked at this canyon form influenced by the slot canyons of the American Southwest, and used that canyon, which was replicated with a wooden screen, to introduce light and air throughout the school environment. Which was also a response to the current COVID epidemic, in which we know one of the main solutions is having light and fresh air throughout.
Great, thank you, Robin. So I'm gonna try to pivot here to discussion. Students or faculty are welcome to join in, and I'd love to hear from our guest critics. I think one of the big differences that we try to explore in these reviews versus a traditional studio review is to chat about areas of the project that may not have been brought up in the conventional review. So the concept of the cold read is one that traditionally abstains from talking about methodology, not to diminish the importance of methodology to each of the professors and students, but it's supposed to do a hard read of the project as it is and how it would activate its context or operate in the many areas. And Epilogues, and I thought the students' presentations, I have to say, did an amazing job of doing this, began to touch upon the future livelihood of these projects in the naming of the projects, in their analyses of the site, and how it could potentially integrate and curate the communities. And all of those are obviously difficult choices, and one project can't do everything. But I just first want to say that I thought the students' presentations, I thought really did a wonderful job of both picking up on the cold read and being epilogues in orientation and kind of projecting into the future what these projects might be. And I'd love to hear from the critics or anybody else about that. I mean, these ask a lot of questions, and the students raise them in their presentations about what the future of learning could be, or what some of the timely issues are that surround the politics of learning environments, and or the fact that this is a former police station, and issues of conservation in the community, and as Neil touched upon, the kind of form language that might relate to that. We saw that in a few projects, using color, using apertures as signals to what is or could be there in the future. And so I'd love to hear any reflections on that from the group.
Well, David, one thing I think might be worth talking about is how a studio at this moment in the student's education interacts with their abilities, interacts with their aspirations, and how far they can take what they're doing. I mean, there are outcomes and questions asked, but by and large, I would characterize this moment as a process of discovery. I mean, this kind of studio, at least as I've experienced it this last semester, is very much a matter of opening the doors to what architecture has as its potential, how it can be used to address the variety of concerns that you laid out. I mean, everything from the program context, community, student experience, history, materiality, construction, movement. I mean, we're touching on all of these aspects as we go through this studio, and it's a heavy lift. There's a lot to cover, and I think the intentionality of the projects in the end, they leave certain questions on the table because they have to, but there is this exploration of what can we do with architecture? How far can we take it? And I think the other job we have as critics is to make it to reveal its amazing potential, the kind of beauty and vibrancy that's possible in architectural expression and exploration. So, I think this is one of the most important studios, and I think moments in our students' evolution. And I think I'm very impressed by all the work that we see on the boards, because I think we've managed to get quite a bit out of it.
Yeah, if I may very briefly follow up on what Jim said.
Theo, can I politely pause you? It is still the students' floor, and Priscilla.
Oh, okay.
Very.
Sorry.
Sorry.
It was as Jim was talking.
I thought you said critics.
You'll be next, Theo. I did, and I will give Theo. You will have the floor next, but Priscilla.
Fair enough.
Asked to ask a question in the chat, so I'd like to give her the floor. This is my job as moderator. Forgive me, but I'll give
Of course.
Great.
Hi. So I guess, I'm new to architecture and the design process. And one thing in design I've learned was taking inspirations from precedent studies and other works, and using that to help construct our own designs. In my own experience with this design, I used mud huts and castles to help figure out what I wanted to do. I guess my question is, as experienced designers, how do you make sure that in this design process, taking inspiration, it's not appropriation, and still making it more an inspirational aspect? Because I know I look at other students' work, and we're like taking inspiration from like places in like Thailand, places in Mexico, and Africa. And how do you ensure that that we're still it doesn't lend itself to appropriation? Since I know in like design process, precedents are a really big thing.
I think this is a great line of inquiry, Priscilla, and I want to give the floor to Theo and then Andrew, but I'd like to pause for a second, because I think this question of cultural appropriation and how we're using precedents and source content is a good, one of many lines of discussion we could meditate on. But I don't know if any. But again, Theo, you'll have the floor right after, and Andrew after that. But if anybody wants to comment on that, I would welcome it.
Well, I would throw one quick thing in there, and I think this has always been an interesting issue in architecture. Appropriation versus synthesis, cultural progress, and I'd suggest that, Priscilla, for just to start to get a handle on this, read a bit of Richard Rorty's writing on cultural evolution, because to kind of put it in the context of how we advance as a culture, what we take, what we give, how we break apart useless conceptual, fabric. And I think it helps because it puts it in a little less charged terms. It says, we can think about this, and we don't have to worry so much about it in a way. So it's a good reference point.
I'll let that maybe sit for a minute and pivot to Theo and Andrew, and then we'll open the floor up again. I think this is a provocative and interesting line of inquiry. So,
yeah.
Theo?
Well, first of all, let me just sort of following up on what Jim said, to reinforce what Jim said. I try to encourage my students, but through their own work, and believing in their own work, not to, in this period of time, what we're living through, not to pivot away from architecture. I don't want to hear about that, okay? Also, for them to continue to believe in the power of architecture, in all its manifestations, to somehow respond to challenges to unprecedented challenges, to challenges that they will have in the future in an equitable and humane way, period. Very, very important. Priscilla, getting back to your question of appropriation, it's not about appropriating. That's dangerous. That becomes, you don't want to create either a physical or visual pastiche or a mental pastiche. You got to be very, very careful. It's about looking at precedent, but not just looking at precedent, experiencing precedent, actually experiencing different kinds of environments, different kinds of societies, different kinds of building types, and so on and so forth. And then saying, what do I feel? What has resonated with me with a particular building, a particular neighborhood, a particular group of people that I have come into contact with? And how will that inform my own thinking, my own conceptualizing as a creative person? That's extremely important. So I do want to draw that distinction between appropriation or just taking ideas, if you will, from other people, as opposed to increasing your own knowledge based on your own personal experience.
Andrew,
I would go ahead.
Sorry, it's Andrew's turn. Andrew, you had a question or an observation?
Yes.
Yeah.
One thing that I found striking as we were going through these presentations was the difference between schools that engage with the possibility of a difference in how we handle a school in a increasingly decentralized educational paradigm, online schools, Zoom classrooms like this as a potential permanent aspect of education, and expanding that a little bit into office environments, other institutional group learning spaces, or shared group spaces in general. How can we as architecture students or as educators or as architects react to and adapt to potential decentralization of group spaces?
Excellent question, Andrew. And I'd like to invite the floor if there's any responses to that. Any thoughts from critics or faculty? We haven't heard from, I think, any guest critics other than Neil. If anybody would like to jump in on this point or others.
I'll just get everybody started so that they warm up, because, the faculty have been thinking about this for 3 months now. Well, actually longer, because when we were planning it, we were thinking about it. So just to get the guest critics warmed up, I think this is an extremely interesting question, Andrew, that you're bringing up. And I think that it is larger than the program that we've been addressing, because it becomes a civic question. And so, this was something that was particularly important to me, but it comes down to a kind of societal responsibility to educate our kids. It's social justice. As far as like the different platforms, it really just comes down to the relationship between a teacher and a student. So, no matter how you dice it and slice it. So there is also that. So I would say that like on one side of the spectrum, it just comes down to the relationship between a teacher and a student. The kids need adults that see them, that bigger see them. And then on the other side of it is, it really stops being about the school and it starts being about civic space, and, irrespective of whether it's urban or not too, it comes down to a kind of like a community responsibility, and in some ways like a mini society, within the larger community. I don't know. Hopefully I would love to hear from the guest critics too, but I know that this is such a, I don't know if it was Jim or someone else who said this before. Maybe it was one of the student presentations, but this is such a really like, we've given you like the tip of the iceberg, as far as like what we did all semester. We addressed so many things in so many different ways, that really it's been a terrific semester and a terrific project. So yeah, so maybe some of the guest critics can jump in for these epilogue questions that David addressed before, which have to do with how this is not just about a quote unquote school project, but it's more like the larger context.
I would like to jump in for just 5 seconds before we take the uptake on Maria's question or the other questions about the centralization.
Please, welcome to Catherine Ingram, Professor GAUD. Thanks for coming. Please jump in.
Just back to the precedent question very quickly, where we're prone toward a kind of honoring of the precedent, which is totally natural. You know, we honor the past, gods and lesser gods of architecture and so forth, because there's huge amount of interest in everything that's been done over the centuries. But there's also, what Harold Bloom called the anxiety of influence. And the anxiety of influence means that the influence of the past is very powerful, and therefore it has to be mitigated in a certain sense when you look at precedents in a way that is so that you are allowed your own kind of omnipotence over creativity of the project, and not slavishly have to follow the prior lessons in any sort of inhibiting way. So I think it's important to keep in mind that precedents can be thrown around, and they can be manipulated, and they can be inhabited in different ways, and they can be broken up, and they're all, because there's all sorts of manifestations of them, not just the solid building, even if that, but they're images, you can mess with it. So it's a kind of not dishonorable relationship, but a realization about the powers of influence, and how precedent is both fabulous treasure vault for us, but also is meant to push you toward a kind of rebellion.
Well, Catherine, that's a really interesting. I mean, you've positioned this business as a kind of black and white, either or, resist or conform kind of setup. But there's another way to look at precedent, which I think is to tease out the things in the precedents, in the approach of the past, that are useless to us, and to start to break it where it needs to be broken. I mean, otherwise you lead to a kind of wholesale rejection, and I don't think that is an instructive way, because we do operate within a kind of a context of cultural and understanding. But to be a slave to precedent, or to be, as Philip Johnson was, a kind of absolutely cynical absorber of imagery, a terrible mistake and a terrible hindrance.
I agree. I didn't mean to suggest, and I absolutely have to say I did not mean to suggest that we rebel or reject precedent. In fact, just the reverse, that we actually bring precedent into play all over the place, because that's where it is, all over the place. You can't really operate without it. It's part of the table of operations, and it's a fabulous table of operations. So of course you would not, you wouldn't just wipe it off. The modernists tried to do that, and it was period at the beginning sort of fascinating, and then it gradually was a kind of pathology. So I think that, I'm not suggesting that you turn your back. In fact, I'm saying you just look at it, but also understand this.
I agree with Catherine.
The potential for it is much broader than people have thought in a kind of more conservativist or.
I agree very much with Catherine also, that precedent quite often, we should also look at or learn from history, meaning precedent. There are precedents that are negative. Precedents that, really we can learn much more, that can tell us what not to do as we move forward. So I think it has to be looked at in a more holistic way. Absolutely.
If I may make a couple comments and then invite whoever was trying to talk, maybe you can log in the chat so that I know who's trying to make a couple comments. You can just say, I'd like to make a few comments. I find this conversation interesting, and I want to go back to the students, kind of combine the two questions here and maybe orient this building upon what's been discussed here. But for me personally, I think the concept of re-origination is important here. On one hand, that the problem of originality that Harold Bloom talks about and that Jonathan Latham recently has talked about as a kind of ecstasy of influence that we're seeing pervasively laundered around architecture schools are kind of equal anxieties and problems. And the compelling thing I think about Andrew's question, and I think is the undercurrent of Priscilla's, is how you begin to flip that and re-originate it, displace those origins. And to me, the opportunity of a learning environment is, on one hand, as Maria was pointing to, the actual teaching and learning, but there is also, a vein of conversation we could be having here about the ambient third teacher in the room, which is the building, and how it re-originates, or the proposition, how it re-originates that context and that community and resituates its habits and protocols. And so I think when we get into, and this is not to say these aren't good strategies, but when we get into color or grammar, I think we can ask questions about, is that re-originating patterns of behavior and in urban interactions with one another and the building, and the question of isolation and gathering, teaching and learning, et cetera. I think there's some interesting ways the section of these buildings, propositions, I should say, that the students have made. The stair, as Maria pointed out in her section, starts to jack up and leverage and reorient the way we might experience Sunset Park. And to me, that cold read active lens on these projects, I think, is useful in not maybe generalizing some of these quite provocative issues in relationship to their work. So I will pivot. It looks like Hugh has a couple comments, and Patrick have logged in the chat. Please, if it's open enough, I'm happy to invite open comments, but we do have over 100 people in the room. So if you can just give me a note in the chat that you'd like to say something, I'll give the floor to you. So Q, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I think, again, just basically wrapping up what you just said, the way that we start to mitigate appropriation or sort of falling in love with the precedent is that this process that we do in architecture it's indexical. So eventually, with more iteration, you dig deeper into context, you dig deeper into the experience that people are having in these buildings. So it starts to separate from what you saw before. I think parts of the way that we've innovated things like the decentralized classroom or flipped classroom is that people have started to ask, what do these students need? That's where the innovation really comes from. It's not even just the generative quality of these buildings. It's more so saying that, okay, now that these spaces are here, how can we use them in their alternative forms? I guess what you're looking at right now is my school. It's a school of movement. And I thought to myself, what did I need as a student? What did I need as a kid? And if anything, the thing that I wanted to do most was get out of the classroom, stay away from the classroom, move around as much as I could. And in this room, or in this school, excuse me, the process would be thought of giving these students freedom to see each other, freedom to explore, and in time, having the exterior of the building have freedom to grow. So in the top right corner of the site, there's an extension to the building that allows students and members of the community to use it as a skate park or a community garden. Hopefully we start to see architecture as more of that, and like not just its generations, but like what do people really do in these buildings?
And I think this is it's a great point, Q, and thanks for bringing it up. I mean, you know, the history of physical education and the kind of machinic mid-20th century logic of that in public education as it was ratified in the US leads to gymnasia and playgrounds and a kind of prefabricated, if you will, idea of play. And I think what you're pointing to is how you can expand upon play and learning, you know, and extrude that through the learning environment in a lot of very rich ways through the building, so that they're not seen in binary opposition to one another or partitioned necessarily by class activities. And I think that's quite interestingly done in your scheme. I'd like to invite Patrick to make a comment, and after him, Joe, and again, ask people to try to log in the chat. Conversation may diminish and I'll include you, or you can jump in, but Patrick, please.
Thank you. Thank you all to all the students for some really amazing work and some very, very nice presentations. I think Venice, you started by asking what is school actually, and that's, I mean, a great, very important question here. And obviously, coming here from Copenhagen and sort of just participating in this event, I haven't followed your working process, but I would have loved to see all of your guys, all of the sort of the programs that they have been working with, the diagrams. I mean, what you know, all the questions that sort of shape how you then go into the design, the actual design phase. So what didactics should this school sort of promote? I think 3 or 4 of the presentations touched upon that. Someone mentioned flipped learning, sort of project-based learning. That's one thing. The other one is, I mean, what kind of learning environment do we want to create, and how would that match the persons that will actually use this school? And I'm saying that because in Copenhagen, we had one of the municipalities made a very ambitious strategy. They call it scoop or push in English, trying to reinvent the whole way their schools worked in this municipality, being more project-based, open spaces, lots of, you know, very nice ideas. And it turned out actually that for the strongest students with sort of, you know, high mental capability, it worked very well. But lots of students got sort of lost when the framework was too sort of blurred. So, and I think, I mean, designing a school is probably one of the most important and most meaningful tasks you can have as an architect. And the building sort of becomes, in my opinion, an answer to some very important questions. So it's more to say that I really like that some of you actually touched upon the thoughts about the didactics. But I would have loved to see even more of your considerations before ending in the sort of design phase. Yeah, that's sort of open comment to that.
We're starting to get some good conversations going in the chat here, and you know, Patrick, I think obviously Danish education and indoor outdoor and how their investment in schools is interesting to monitor for anybody who has been monitoring that, and that might be something we could circle back to. Joe, you had logged a few things in the chat. I don't know if you want to elaborate on those.
Very, very quickly, David, I can. If we were to go to the Canyon project, the night view, maybe this is where we could address precedent. So the student was very clear about his precedent on this project, but it's not a literal precedent. He's taken both geometry and also effect, and then he has applied it to his understanding of spatial considerations and airflow and many of the things that he talked about. So I think that this is probably one of the closest alliances to a formal precedent, but at the same time, he removes it completely from its Southwest context.
Yeah, thank you for citing that, Joe. I find this project very compelling. I think it's a great example of re-origination that you're bringing up here. I'd like to give the floor to Reeves, and then after that, we will pivot to Kabaj and Leighton. I'd like to give you also an opportunity to elaborate on your comments in the chat. So Reeves, please jump in. Did we lose him? Or is he muted? It's hard to see everybody in the room. Are you there, Reeves?
Oh, I am. Yeah, I just wanted to ask this question that was a little bit particular to Maria's studio. And so I was wondering how the addition of the playful armor came, if it came with its own share of complications to the design process, since I thought the concept of incorporating kind of like a protective quality to the schools and designing it so it doesn't appear as intimidating as they should be. You know, because since the dangers of school shootings are a relatively like contemporary design consideration, were there any specific challenges that came with designing around those?
Do you want me to answer that, or do you want the students to answer?
Either or. I'm really interested in that.
Okay, well, I'll get us started, and then if anyone wants to jump in, then please do. So, yeah, so we started the project on the inside. The studio has a kind of interiority focus, and then the question then becomes, you know, how do you clothe the building? But we had different things going on. For example, this one that Eric is zooming in and on now. He started, Shui started looking at Sugar Urban at the beginning of the semester, and then he made a literal curtain wall with curtains. The curtains fell out. A lot of things fall out. I still have no way of controlling this after 20 years of teaching, is the number of things that just fall out of the back of the final presentation truck. You know, because sometimes the choices are not the ones I would have made. But anyway, so for example, in Shui's case, he actually literally had curtains at some point. Then in Orsan actually addressed this at the beginning in the video that he and Nicholas made, where he was enclosing the boundary of the city. He was fascinated by the boundary of the city block. You know what Neil earlier had said was, you know, the infill urban project. So he was fascinated by this boundary, and then try to kind of poke in it too. So it started out being taught, and then it became less taught. So that was another thing that came about. But I would say that it's not specific to what in schools is called. So it's really fascinating actually about schools, because on the one hand, you have getting out as quickly as possible. So you have egress questions, which I think to me it's interesting, not because it's the thing that a building needs, but it's interesting because it then provides ways in which the architecture can kind of blossom through that need of just getting people out, right? And then on the other hand, there is the kind of lockdown idea, right? Which generations previous to this one had with the, you know, if you watch some of those 1950s Dock and Cover, you know, where in the event of a nuclear attack by Russia, kids were supposed to, you know, duck and cover under their desks. So this is not the first time that we've been around the block with this kinds of issues. I would say that from my perspective, this was a provocation to them. When I say to them, go forth and make me a playful armor, you know, go look at samurai costumes at the Met. It's a provocation to them. It's not really an assignment for them to do this, but it's just, if I say this to you, what are you going to answer? Does that make sense?
Thank you, Maria. I want to, and thank you, Reeves, for the question. I think we will probably be able to pick up on some of this in other conversation, but I just want to include a few more voices, noting that we have 25 minutes left, and give the floor to Kabaj, after which we will give it to Leighton. Please. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's
No, I can't hear anything.
Yeah, Kabaj, your sound is a bit slow right now.
great work being done
There you go.
by the student. Extent, you didn't make me?
Now we have you. Now we have you, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. We're dealing with the challenged internet. I was just commenting on I was just commenting on the work. I mean, it's clearly the stage of the students and where they are right now. In terms of the style of presentation, I mean, you gave us a lot to digest in a few minutes, even if you had, we had the luxury of looking at the work prior. I think my comment relates to a few things. Firstly, to do with precedent. There was quite a lot of back and forth, and it's quite interesting to think of precedent as an important territory of developing your whole research. But coming from, I think, where we are from as cavers, I mean, we look at the Anthropocene and really look at it as what it's challenging to do with how we look at the past and how our whole literary history, and especially in architecture, it's really been put to task when you look at the times we're living in. I mean, the space that we are right now in a sort of crit room through a digital platform, I mean, it very much touches on the now and what we're experiencing, and the way we look at our history, look at the past and the references we use, it's completely up for questioning. So I just wanted to highlight that. But touching on something that was quite interesting and maybe highlighting Professor Maria's studio, where they begin, or at least began to drill down to sort of interesting territories within the public realm. And one of the students using references of the sort of shops and the environments and the sort of immediate reference point, I found that was quite driving for the projects, and looking at the public space coming in and those moments of connection with the environment. And not to say other studios didn't have that, but there was something really interesting with a deep connection with the context, which I sort of felt, okay, could be taken to the next step in many ways. But either way, I think it's really exciting to have that sort of freedom to look at these ideas and bring them into a very complex program as education. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Yeah, Kabaj, I mean, it's interesting because you have a practice that kind of appropriates spaces for discourse, if you will. I mean, at least that's part of the work that as I understand, part of the praxis of Cave Bureau, and I find that quite interesting as a method of reorigination. And I think we see some of those tendencies in some of the work here today, where they're kind of using opportunities, and you were noting some of them in Maria's section, but we could see it obviously also in other sections where they're seeing latent attributes in the site and kind of inhabiting them in different ways. And to me, I find that, again, that concept of reoriginating, it can be done a lot of different ways, but it's certainly something I find super compelling about your work and scholarship and practice, and something that I think resonates with some of the work here. So thank you for those comments. Leighton, I'd like to invite you to elaborate on your great observations in the chat, if you would like to take an opportunity to do so.
Yeah, thank you. And it is a remarkable body of work, especially when some of the students have come from other disciplines and are joining architecture for the first time. It's an extraordinary display of a particular kind of teaching and an uptake by students of precedent. And I think this notion of origination, of re-origination from an understanding of typology is really quite important. What I think also is that it serves as a really useful research document of the ways in which one approaches these sorts of sites and these sorts of sensitivities. And it also begins to tease out in almost every project that we've seen, it teases out that tension between our understanding of the nature of a building for education, the notion that a building for education is meant to, in some way, provide us with a place in which we exchange and develop this backward and forward notion. And so what spaces are they like before we talk about the nature of the building? And the other thing is about the way the building engages, I think, with its exterior situation. What I mean by that is its atmosphere, I mean its sound, its particulars that are in the atmosphere itself. How does it deal with that? And when we talk about notions of armor, whether that armor is defined around the use and the physical need, the need to protect, in a sense of the engagement atmospherically, as opposed to physically. You could almost argue that has kind of liberated us to some extent from the need to protect the building in terms of a solid form. And we heard about curtain and some other things, which I think lend some of that notion. I also think there's another notion that's come out of looking at these things, which is about, which was mentioned at the very beginning, this sense of vertical transference in a building where you have to have many groups doing many things, and how do you make that work? I think that as you go through these projects, you begin to see these strands taken out very strongly in set projects. And I think it's a really great learning tool. And so it's a privilege to see how this has worked in this short space of time. But I would say that as a kind of an outcome, it points the way to some of the real problems we have with the architectural building for this purpose, which are, how do you democratize them? How do you make a building not intimidating to one group of people? What symbolism does it have in terms of that transition from the street to the view of the building, to the inside and its activities? If you're going to make education democratic, then there has to be a language or a series of languages that allow that situation to be one of welcome. So we almost have to change the way in which we look at that. And as I look at these images changing on screen, you begin to see that being played out. And I think that's really remarkable. The breaking down of the barrier between the inside and the outside, the creation of public space and transient, the space for the movement of landscape in and on and around these spaces. And I think that's a really difficult thing to do. And these guys have done this very quickly. And I'm really impressed by that. I think also that when you look at this notion of the purpose, I mean, I keep on thinking about Hans Scharoun and the Berlin Philharmonic for some reason. It just came into my head. Because really, the building is just a glade, in his case. It's a glade with a tree. And at the bottom is a lake. And it's built for sound. And somehow, it doesn't really matter what the outside of it looks like, because it's equally intimidating to all. It's equally welcoming to all. I think it's one of the key things about when you go to a place, what is it that makes you want to be there? What makes you want to be involved in it? And I think there's a lot to be learned from the places that young people like to go to. What draws them? What makes them want to stay? I think this range of projects begins to sort of flesh out those notions.
Well, thank you, Leighton. Lots of, I think, really poetic and interesting observations there. I mean, the cognitive space that you incited in the chat of flipped learning and different modalities of that, which I think you touched upon in your verbal comments just now, as kind of moving between play and learn, public and private, landscape and building, I think is really important to talk about that welcoming aspect, because of course, there's a very traditional way of thinking we need a kind of isolated cognitive space to focus, and that play is very distracted and we can't focus. And so how these students begin to develop different rhythms and densities of cognition, I would say, or attentiveness, is quite important. And you see that playing out in the spatial textures and formal language of the buildings. I also appreciate very much the reference to Sharoon. I think what's interesting about the Berlin Philharmonie is the sectional and almost gravitational aspects of that project, and obviously the sonics of it, that give it a kind of welcoming leakiness, if you will, that allows you to kind of slip into it and find your way into it. And again, I think some of the sectional more than elevational work in these projects and how students are contouring entry to kind of literally drop you in off the sidewalk. I mean, Q kind of brought this up in his skateboarding ramps, but if you look at the sections and a lot of the projects, there's shifts down and kind of literally almost secretly pulling you off the sidewalk into these buildings that I think resonates, at least for me. I agree that could resonate quite strongly with some of the sectional work we see, certainly in the Philharmonic. There are a few other questions and chats. I'm noting Aisha's query here. I want to give Neil and Steve an opportunity to ask their questions and a couple of observations, and then we'll maybe end with Aisha, noting that there's 12 minutes left. We'll see how it goes. But Steve, do you want to jump in and share a few observations?
Yeah, it's actually ironic. Aisha's comment was mine, but I wanted to first, I guess, congratulate the work of the studios. I think it's for first year, this is very advanced in terms of both the technique, and it was really interesting to hear how each studio professor, as represented by the students that sort of took the course and talked about it, the genesis for all the projects, and see how each project in each studio section landed relative to all the questions on the table, the signification of a pedagogy, thinking about teaching, thinking about learning, thinking about play. All these are a multitude of things layered on top of issues of typology and context and site. So I applaud all the work that I'm seeing in the conversations that we're able to have as a result. But mine goes also back to both Aisha's and Leighton's comments about both atmosphere and signification, and asking anyone who's interested in picking it up, how the existing building became instrumental when the students sort of cycled out of the techniques they were given to approach the project, and they were sort of layering in their own concerns based on the conversations they were having in their own studios. I'm wondering when the existing building, given this moment we're having with the police and with monuments, this is both, how that became significant in either attaching, destroying, erasing, engaging. If anyone wants to speak to that, because I think that is really super significant as a part of the context. How do you deal with that? How do you deal with its legacy, its image, its significance? Who can speak to that?
I thought it was interesting. I think from my research, I think there's a couple of organizations who are trying to preserve the facade. And in my design, and I think most, not all, but most of the students in our section were considering demolishing the whole facade. And I think it's because the facade is from a police station. And I know from the documents I've read and what they're doing right now is that they're trying to save the facade because it has historical meaning to it. But I don't know, it's interesting because with this, like with Black Lives Matter, and now we're recontextualizing our lens of like the justice system and policing. I would like disagree with, I know the proposal that's going on right now for this building that's being built, and that I don't think the facade and what it represents adds any value to the community. And yeah, that's how most of us feel in our section. And for us, we're thinking of a complete demolition of what's there.
Alex, you want to speak to that?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex. After this, I'm gonna give the floor to Neil to make a few observations, and we can see what the time's left. But please, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, so I also in very similarly felt like it should kind of just be completely demolished, but I wanted to think about sort of two things. If we are my first thought about keeping the facade, which I thought was kind of a requirement at first, was that we have to keep it accountable, and keep that history, to remember that history and to learn from that history. And I didn't quite know how keeping it there was helpful to that, because I don't know how you're going to remember that history without having a plaque or documentation or something that is kind of describing that. But I guess that could be part of that or could be part of the historical landmark part of it. But I also was really kind of didn't like the whole historical landmark aspect of it, and thought that keeping the facade was mainly part of an efficiency kind of thing, and sort of reframing the facade from being one of an imposing structure to one of a structure of exploration. So turning the tower from looking down and keeping locking people in and kind of observing the outside to looking up and observing the climate, and maybe acting more like a lighthouse that is inviting. And yeah, I think those were mostly kind of my perspective, and kind of the aesthetic design of mine, kind of visually seeing the facade decomposing and being deconstructed, and sort of a kid's take over the police station, and it kind of gets forgotten that it's a police station. Also, have to remember. Although I was a little concerned that if my purpose was efficiency, that maybe it's not structurally sound to actually keep it anyway. So I do think that completely demolishing it is a fine thing and a good thing. But and I also just thought that my design, it's kind of you could build it around anything. More, it's kind of like a scaffolding. So it's kind of a very modular and sort of yeah.
I mean, I, as I'm sure many critics do, fully appreciate that struggle, and I laud you.
Yeah, so I also was maybe it's not efficient, and in that case, it really should be taken out. And if it's not safe, it really should be taken out. So.
I laud you for taking that on and struggling with that and trying to give it a new set of habits and origins. I think the ones you just described, Alex, were really quite telling of methods to begin to struggle with that. I mean, of course, in the space of a academic studio, we don't have to uphold the brief that's being ratified at the policy level here, and we welcome students to approach and faculty to approach that from a range of ways, which we can see here. But I also think there are some important takeaways, even if you don't agree with them, that you discovered through that. And I think in line with Jim's earlier comments about discovery, you know, your observations there, Alex, were really quite, I think, telling. I would like to give the floor to Neil Denari, who wanted to make a couple of comments, and then invite student for a final comment. I think Priscilla was trying to make a couple ending comments. Priscilla, if you don't mind, let me just invite Neil to chime in if he would still like to, and I'll let you have the final word in this session, Priscilla. Yeah, Neil.
Yeah, so incredible panorama of work, and I think it does represent different ways in which the faculty are treating, let's say, foundational design and first year design. I just wanted to make a couple points, one in reference to precedents, and David mentioned the Jonathan Lethem text, Ecstasy of Influence, which of course is a reference to the Bloom article. I would say that another version of that would be the ecstasy of inspiration. And this is the cautionary thing I would speak to students about, which actually speaks directly to school, and that is how we learn. So learning, you know, can become one form of research or one form of dilettantism. Of course, dilettantism is what we want to distance ourselves from. We can become unconscious to that. So searching for inspiration versus a precedent, you know, you think of precedents embedded with history, if it's in the canon, et cetera, and then inspiration is something quicksilver and momentary. And when the precedent, when the inspirational image becomes the blueprint, then you have a problem, because then you're essentially in the ecstasy of the nature of influence as a thing that you believe is leading you toward, you know, answers. I think Jim's idea of cutting away what's not useful means you actually have to study and research. And one thing I would say is whatever or whoever your favorite architect is, and if you don't have one, it may be because of a diffuse nature of looking. Not that you have to have a you know, favorite architects, but study 10 buildings by one or two people, not one image or a hit. Think of, you know, bands that you like and so forth, and, you know, you're into them. So therefore you can have critical thinking as opposed to understanding, there's my model, I'll have to make this is it, all or nothing, or revert to the nature of collecting, the nature that can lead to a certain kind of dilettantism. So that's what I speak to my students about. And I think first year, second year, third year, we're all trying to cope with the issue of the age of access. I think vis-a-vis schools, I think of libraries and museums. And of course, when I did a studio on museums and I asked my students, when was the last time you were in a museum? They all looked away from me and said, well, I can't remember. And now libraries, of course, we, not simply because of distance learning, in the age of access, you know, that's shifted. The question about learning, you know, post-COVID, it's interesting. When your house, which is formally understood as a refuge, takes on the sign form of the prison, which it has, in the outside world, for which we usually use to create refuge from, now desperately we want to be a part of it. The school as the refuge, as the school versus the school as a disciplining world. So museums and libraries, when they're operating, have a certain aspect of, let's say, the social attached to them, lunch at the museum versus hours and hours of contemplative viewing. The school, and Patrick understands this from Danish ways of thinking about the relationship between learning and the nature of the social, starting from the kindergarten, which is like the foundation of you know, what interesting schools are, especially post 68 in America. it's a referendum, and here's where I think about another precedent, or a couple of precedents vis-a-vis the school. One would be Toyo Ito's Sendai Media Tech building, where he wrote a text and said, my goal is to get rid of walls. No walls. So walls take on division, walls take on political references. And while there's a lot of extruded surface here in the Gestalt sense, I want to look at this as either Bill's movement system pushing away walls, pushing away limits, or stratification and the dominance of active floor plates versus facades, notwithstanding the issue of the kind of cultural nature or relevance of the existing building, which I think Stephen's question is a good one. This is all the idea that the school is only action and energy, and contemplation is wrapped up in the form of the social. As weird as that may seem, you know, that we're going to learn in critical theory collaborative modes as opposed to singular autonomous modes, which is what we've been forced to do, you know, in our houses. In other words, learning in isolation, and so isolation has led to forms of distraction. It's a mirror of all of that. And so I think all of these schools are not only a critique of institutions, but also of the will to the double-edged idea of the social. On the one hand, we think of responsibility, and then on the other hand, we think of the nature of the collective. And the last reference would be Melnikov's Workers Tower, shrink wrapping, you know, collectivity, you know, in this particular agency of the nature of the social, and the will to, you know, give form, you know, in an strong optical sense to the nature of the condensing of the social is embedded in all of these projects, whether it's no walls or facade. And it's indicative of our time, and it's really fantastic work. That's just my kind of cultural overview.
And it is quite an overview. I think there's lots to chew on there that, you know, maybe might come up in other sessions. I want to, first of all, ask Eric to maybe stop flying around the Miro board so we can all see each other. Second of all, invite Priscilla back to make a final student comment, and then I will have a thing or two to say at the very end. Priscilla, the floor is yours.
Okay, I'll make this quick. It was just a thought I had as I was exploring like this project, which is like an interesting project because you're kind of referencing your own student conceptual work, and the reality of this building is actually being built. So you have documents to know like what is going on with it. And I found it really intriguing, and I have like criticisms on how this building is being funded as far as like it's using like the Office of Parks and Recreation Preservation Organization is using it as it being a historical site as the main argument, and like why they will be funding the building, and to keep the facade as well. And I don't know, I just thought that was interesting. And I don't know, as a student, it makes you like question like your conceptual work and the realities of what would happen if you were to do this in the real world, and what compromises would you have to make, and what things you'd have to consider with different organizations. So yeah, sorry, that was the only thought I had.
Well, those are, you know, I think that's the spirit of today's discussion, Priscilla. So I'm glad on one hand you recognize them, and I'm not sure we could, you know, we're here to offer answers more than kind of maybe explore that territory that you're raising. But I think that, you know, when Alex was talking, again, I think, you know, we can challenge a brief, but we can't dispute it entirely in our role as speculators and people operating within the municipal and economic milieu. And so I think how you tinker with that is really important. And Patrick's been a part of creative funding for projects, and what you're pointing out, Priscilla, is a kind of weird portfolio of funding streams for a school, which on one hand is interesting and maybe a little alarming at the same time, I think, as you're sharing with us. And I appreciate those observations. I would just say, you know, one thing that to draw binary positional statements that say we can't work with it, that the context is too supercharged to keep it, that the reasons why we would keep it would be funding or economic, to me are less interesting than ones that say, I believe in my equipment as a designer, and I believe I can do something with that will give it a level of habituation and urbanity that will make it very different than it was originally. And I think that I see a lot of that in the work. And Alex's example is maybe one where it's the least contaminated at the curb, but when we get into his building, we start to see it pushing out and starting to work on that facade in other ways. Obviously, in Matt's project for Jim's studio, we saw it become more cannibalized. But I think the complexities of the history and how we dislodge that, coming back a bit to Steve's point, to give it new origins and maybe new future histories that could both honor and commemorate atrocities or things we need to remind ourselves of, as much as it could provide new ideas of parks and recreation, as you're pointing to, Priscilla, that might be more vertically formatted than we're traditionally used to understanding them in New York City, to me are some of the interesting opportunities of this project that I think many of you have touched upon, and certainly the conversation this morning has begun to crack open. So I love the fact that you're asking this question. I just need to say that at the end, because I think it's exactly, if we can get anywhere, it's there. It's to the point of asking it. And that's a wonderful thing to see from a first-year student. And I appreciate your persistence in engaging today, as well as other students, Priscilla. But I'm really excited that we've gotten here. And we always have an insufficient amount of time to address these things. So I'm going to suggest that we close this session. We do need to not out-Zoom ourselves. We have a long day ahead of us. We're going to come back to this room at 1 o'clock. We're going to pause the recording on YouTube until then, when we will be looking at the Studio of Experiments work and some of the MS, Master of Science work on Governor's Island. So wherever you are, take a breather, have dinner, have lunch, get a cocktail. If it's later in the day, feel free. For those of us in New York, it's probably a little too early for that, but whatever gets you through the day. And we look forward to all of the students and faculty and everybody else adjourning here at 1 o'clock. Thank you, students. Great to see your involvement here today, and faculty, and look forward to seeing you all in about 50 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.